June 29, 2015. Thessaloniki. Anastasios Gevelidis, 74 years old, arrived at the National Bank of Greece at 4 in the morning. He had no bank card. He needed his pension. There were already 100 retirees ahead of him in the queue. A bank employee emerged at 8 and told them no money today. By that morning, 42 billion had already left Greek banks. The locks were not for the money that mattered. This is not fiction. This was Greece 2015. That is where the forensic record has to start. Not in Brussels, not in the central bank memo. In a line of pensioners before sunrise, because the official story said this was a national emergency measure. Temporary, universal, necessary to protect the system. But if it was universal, why were some people already out? Here is the part that changes the entire frame. By the time Gevelidis stood outside that branch in Thessaloniki, the decisive money had already moved. Not his money. Bigger money. Faster money. Money with lawyers, offshore routes, institutional contacts, and enough warning to treat a public emergency as a private scheduling problem. He had none of that. He had a queue, and that queue was not an accident. It was the visible residue of a hidden sequence. First, months of deposit flight. Then emergency liquidity keeping the banks upright. Then an ECB decision on a weekend. Then the state closing the doors on everyone still inside. Stay with me. Because this is where most accounts become useless. They tell you Greece imposed capital controls. True, but incomplete. What they usually do not say is more important. The controls did not stop the escape. They documented that the escape had already happened. Anastasios Gevelidis arrived at 4 in the morning believing the bank still performed its most basic function, to convert a pension into bread. It didn't. If you only look at the morning the doors closed, you miss the mechanism that made that morning inevitable. Greek banks did not suddenly become fragile on June 28, 2015. They had already been surviving on emergency support for months. The formal instrument was Emergency Liquidity Assistance, ELA. In February 2015, the ceiling was around 50 billion. By June, it had climbed toward 87 billion, with the final ceiling reaching roughly 89 billion. That is not a detail in the margin. That is the X-ray. A banking system that needs escalating emergency liquidity for 5 straight months is not stable, and then suddenly interrupted. It is already in controlled deterioration, and controlled is the important word, because ELA kept the banks alive without resolving the underlying political deadlock between the Greek government, the ECB, and Greece's creditors. It bought time, not safety. It allowed deposits to keep leaving while the official structure remained standing, long enough to preserve the appearance of continuity. That is the pattern. The fawade remains operational while the exits remain open for those who can still use them. Anastasios Gevelidis did not live in that layer of the system. He saw an ATM, a branch, a pension, a weekday, normal things, but above him sat a much narrower machine. Collateral rules, governing council decisions, daily liquidity permissions, and the quiet knowledge that if the ceiling stopped rising, the retail banking system would stop functioning almost immediately. And then the switch was thrown. On the weekend of June 27, 28, 2015, the ECB Governing Council decided not to raise the ELA ceiling further. That was the trigger, not some abstract idea that Greece was irresponsible in the long run. Not a slow deterioration in public finances that became unbearable overnight. The direct trigger was operational. Liquidity support was frozen while deposit pressure continued. Once that happened, the Greek government no longer had a functioning banking system to defend in the normal sense. It had a countdown. So the government responded the only way governments usually respond, when the monetary plumbing stops working, but the political story must continue. It gated access. Branches shut. Withdrawals were restricted. Transfers were controlled. And the public was told this was protection. But protection from what? That is the question. Because if the emergency measure arrives after months of escalating ELA, after billions have already left, after institutional actors have already repositioned, then the measure is not primarily stopping flight. It is sorting the population by what kind of access they still have left: cash access, card access, foreign access, no access. That is why the scene in Thessaloniki matters so much. Gevelidis was not standing at the beginning of the crisis. He was standing at the end of the escape window. Now you can see why the famous 60 number is remembered so clearly, and remembered so badly, because the headline implied symmetry. Everyone suffers the same limit. Everyone suffers the same emergency. The system bends, but it bends evenly. That is not what the record shows. The legislative act issued on June 28, 2015, did create a withdrawal cap, but the practical effect depended on what kind of person you were inside the banking system. If you held a Greek-issued card, you entered the visible regime, daily ATM limits, branch restrictions, and an immediate reduction of your usable cash life to a bureaucratic ration. If you held a foreign-issued card, you were exempt from the domestic restriction. You could still withdraw. If you had already moved funds abroad before June 28, those funds were already outside the gate. No 60 ceiling touched them. And if, like Anastasios Gevelidis, you had no bank card at all and depended on in-person branch access, the state created special pension arrangements that effectively pushed you into an even narrower channel. In practice, not more flexibility, less. That is the detail most people never hear. The famous number was real, but it was not universal. It was a sorting mechanism disguised as a common rule, and once you see that, the deposit flight numbers stop looking like background context and start looking like the main event. By that morning, roughly 22 billion had already left Greek banks between January and May 2015, with later estimates placing total outflows, including cash withdrawals, closer to 50 billion. The controls did not prevent that movement. They arrived after it. They were the administrative residue of a run already well advanced. So who's already out? Not everyone with money. That is too crude. The divide was narrower and more brutal than that. It separated people by speed, by institutional literacy, by whether they had an offshore destination ready, by whether their banker returned their call, by whether they understood that an emergency in public language often means a private deadline has already passed. Gevelidis did not have a private banker. He had a pension claim. He did not have a transfer structure. He had a physical branch. He did not have warning he could act on. He had a rumor made concrete only when the employee walked outside and said there was no money today. That is what capital controls often are in forensic terms, not the first act of defense. The last administrative act after the decisive advantages have already been distributed, and if you want to know whether a policy is protective or merely restrictive, ask a very simple question. Who was free before the rule was announced? Because those are usually the people the rule no longer reaches. The buried lead was not a 60 limit. It was the duration. Most people remember Greek capital controls as a brief emergency. A few chaotic weeks. Maybe a few months. A banking panic. Then normalization. No. The controls imposed in late June 2015 were only fully lifted on September 1st, 2019. 4 years and 2 months. And that matters because it tells you what the policy really was. Not a single emergency action. An administrative regime, a rolling system of permissions, exceptions, amendments, and staged release. Not one coherent wall, but a gate adjusted again and again. As political conditions changed and creditor confidence returned on their terms, not yours. That is a different thing entirely. A temporary closure says the system is sick. A 4-year permission structure says the system has changed form, and the human reality did not end after the camera crews left. On July 3, 2015, also in Thessaloniki, AFP photographed Georgos Chatsafodiadis, 77 years old, crying outside a National Bank of Greece branch. After he said he had been turned away from 4 branches and could not collect his wife's 120 pension. That image circulated globally. Most viewers saw it as a symbol of a short emergency. The record says otherwise. He was not standing in front of a passing storm. He was standing at the entrance to a new access regime. And notice what that means for Anastasios Gevelidis. His queue was not just a scene of panic. It was the opening frame of a much longer reality. A retiree without a card was not merely inconvenienced by a sudden weekend decision. He was moved into a narrower channel of life for an unknown period, under rules that could be amended repeatedly from above, with no guarantee that temporary meant anything recognizable at street level. That is the pattern official narratives conceal. They describe the start date. They rarely emphasize the administrative afterlife, because once a control system exists, institutions learn from it. Ministries refine it. Banks adapt to it. Exemptions accumulate. Workarounds become formal, and the public gradually shifts from asking when normality returns to asking what is still permitted this week. That shift is everything. It is the moment a crisis measure becomes habitat. And that is why the Greek case matters far beyond Greece. Not because every country will copy the exact legal form. They won't. But because the logic is portable. Freeze access. Call it temporary. Widen discretion. And let time do the political work. The queue disappears first. The apparatus stays. Now move the setting. Keep the mechanism. Nigeria, 2016 to 2023. Different country, different currency, different legal structure, same basic logic. The official system said there was one exchange regime. In practice, there were at least 2 realities. On June 1, 2023, the Central Bank of Nigeria's official rate was about 460, 9 to the dollar, while the parallel market traded around 407.40 to 740 to 740, a gap of roughly 6%. That spread was not just a pricing anomaly. It was a permissions map. It told you who had institutional access and who didn't. Because a protected rate is never just a number. It is a gate. If you were a well-connected importer, a large firm, or an actor close enough to official allocation channels, you could access dollars at the protected side of the system. Your costs were real but buffered. Your margin of error was wider. You transacted in the country the policy claimed to govern. If you were a small trader, an informal operator, or anyone outside those channels, you meet the other Nigeria, the one priced by scarcity, the one priced by delay, the one priced by uncertainty. You paid the parallel rate and absorbed the loss directly. Same nation, same currency, different reality. That is why this is a true parallel to Greece and not just another currency story. In both cases, the restriction was presented in broad public language, stability, order, protection, but the actual outcome depended on proximity to the access point that mattered. In Greece, cash and transfer access. In Nigeria, dollar access. In both cases, the policy was formally national and functionally selective. And when Nigeria moved to unify the exchange rate in June 2023, the old gap did not vanish cleanly. The naira depreciated violently. On paper, one rate. In lived reality, the spread and access problems persisted well into 2024. The mechanism changed form, not function. This is the lesson. Controls do not need to look like locked bank branches to perform the same social sorting function. Sometimes they look like a dual-rate currency system. Sometimes they look like transfer approvals. Sometimes they look like temporary liquidity management, but of fear. Ask the same question every time. Who gets the protected channel? That answer tells you more than the public policy language ever will. So what did Anastasios Gevelidis understand that the policy documents did not say? He understood the only question that matters when a system moves from normal banking to gated access. Can you still convert your claim into life? Not nominally, operationally. His answer came at 4 in the morning in Thessaloniki. He had a pension entitlement. He had a bank. He had a state promise behind both. And still, he stood in line for access to cash he could not reach, while saying in the words reported that day that they did not have enough money to buy bread. That is the forensic reality of capital controls, not abstract stabilization, purchasing power delayed until it becomes dependence. So let me be precise about the takeaway. This is not an argument that every restriction is identical. Greece in 2015 is not Nigeria in 2023. A bank closure is not a dual-rate currency regime, and not every depositor can or should respond the same way. But the pattern is stable when emergency liquidity keeps rising, when official language becomes more reassuring as access conditions worsen, when sophisticated money exits before public rules tighten, when a temporary measure acquires an amendment history. You are no longer looking at protection in the ordinary sense. You are looking at a gate, and gates do one thing above all else. They divide people by timing. That is the binary the forensic record leaves you with. You recognize the sequence early enough to move some part of your life outside the channel that can be frozen, rationed, or repriced. Or you arrive at 4 in the morning, like Anastasios Gevelidis, and discover that what was yours yesterday is now available only by permission. That is the choice, not optimism or pessimism, positioning.